Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I just came back from Ukraine where I had the chance to talk with the military, talk with some very high level analysts. Unfortunately, they didn't really fully allow me to reference their names, but I'm pretty sure, like, if you're following any news in Ukraine, you've heard some of their names. Just unfortunately, I cannot tell them. But the point of the matter is there was a lot of questions about the state of the Ukrainian forces that I just really wanted to find out, and I was able to ask these questions and get pretty frank and honest answers. So today we are going to be talking about a topic that I really want to cover, but I always felt that a lot of my knowledge is too far away, which is specifically what is the state of the Ukrainian military. How far are we from being good or something? What are the actual issues and what is the seriousness of those issues? Like is there a chance that Ukrainian military can collapse, so to say? Those fears I've heard airing on my channel, on other channels. Obviously, Russian and other propagandists have been telling that Ukrainian army is about to collapse. Unfortunately for them, it will not. The spoilers up ahead. So let's talk in details about what are the issues in Ukrainian military and what is the state of solving these issues. If there was one video which you wanted to find out in details everything that you wanted to know about the actual state of Ukrainian military, this is it. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but we're going to talk about everything. Grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and let's get into it. I'm going to start with the biggest issue in Ukrainian military that is miles and miles ahead of even anything that comes closely second. And most of the people that follow in war in Ukraine are going to be like, I know. He's going to talk about the manpower shortage. And you will be wrong, because the people that actually interacted with the live military in action will probably understand much better what is the biggest issue in the military. And the answer is very simple. Morons. Wrong people at the wrong position at the wrong time. In a common, peaceful time, those people are annoying to deal with. They are causing major issues, hurdles, sometimes losses in time and effort and resources. But in a wartime, their approach is costing lives, actual human lives. And it's a somewhat wide category of morons that we're talking about here. They range from people that just are fucking stupid. That is true. There are people just like that. And then some reason, one or the other, they just get promoted to something. It could have been because of the way that Ukrainian military is structured. That at some point, it was a professional military from 2014 to 2022. Yet with the Russian full-scale invasion, it was the more competent force that was stopping the Russian invasion, and then it was supplemented with the mobilized force. And who are the mobilized people? Well, those are the people that were supposedly finishing military some time ago, where they could have gotten any kind of designation nominally. And then because they got that designation, whether it's going to be like some kind of a officer or person that is responsible for supplies or whatnot, these people then get put in these positions and they have no clue what they're doing. Absolutely no clue. And then if that person is also not very bright, well, it's not going to help a lot. And unfortunately, because Ukraine is using this system where they got to grow their military many times over, a lot of these positions are filled by people specifically like that. And if we go beyond just people that are dumb, and we get into people that maybe not completely dumb, but they are just, I don't want to say incompetent because it can be malicious to an extent, but let's say they just don't want to take responsibility for anything. Let's say they're afraid to take responsibility. So then they don't do action. They don't take decisions that they're supposed to be taking. Like a person that, for example, we talked about responsible for the inventory. He decides that he doesn't want to, like, for example, a unit requests that they send more ammunition, more resources because suddenly their position is too hot. Yet this person doesn't want to go in details on how to distribute resources. Instead, he has this little book which says that for example, distribution of resources should happen like once every week or something like this, you know? So there's some kind of protocol. And instead of understanding that this is a time of great peril, great war, a person in that position could essentially, by not supplying and not allowing the supply of equipment to that position specifically that requests additional supplies, potentially killed a whole great regiment, sorry, not regiment, but a whole great unit of people that otherwise potentially could have stopped massive Russian attack. And these stories, they happen all across frontline daily. Then beyond that, there are people that are just liars, people that want to pretend that they're working better than they would working otherwise. This is the most prominent in some kind of lower officer level corps. For example, when Russians are coming in and taking their positions, and they're like, okay, if I report that we lost positions, then potentially I get some kind of a penalty for myself. But I don't want that. Like, we can try to, like, maybe later on, if Russians advance on some other positions, and then we kind of go as a group, then it's gonna say, it's like, oh, Russians just attacked and like collapsed the whole area rather than just my position. You know, and they lie and they say like, no, we are still holding that position. And then they're sending additional reinforcements to that position. But that position is not belonging to Ukrainians at all. So these people are prevalent, and they're prevalent on all levels. And there is no good way of circumventing them. This is the most prominent problem. And the only way that this problem is being solved is by experience. The issue is that military doesn't have the ability to just substitute someone for someone else just because the resources are relatively fixed. You work with what you have. And this means that this will continue happening, that people that are just morons will continue killing Ukrainian forces that otherwise would have succeeded. We see less of this happening than before, mostly because the whole army is just getting more experienced. Beyond that, there is additional work that is happening to cut off a lot of the bureaucratic layer, because a lot of these people, they end up in these bureaucratic positions. A good example of this is what, for example, Magyar has been proposing within the unmanned system forces by introducing, removing the paper trail, like removing the necessity to submit papers to some specific person and instead just input data in some centralized database. So a technological solution to circumvent these morons. But beyond that, there's nothing that really can be done. Obviously, additional training, additional optimization will happen, but generally speaking, and this is going to be sad to say, this problem is still present in Ukrainian military as it was present before, and everything is pointing that it will be present going forward. And this problem is fundamental because very often this problem what leads to a lot of the other problems, because people, when they are working in this environment filled with morons that are taking moronic actions or inactions, it frustrates a lot of people, and then we get into the second point, which is the manpower shortage. This problem is not a secret to anyone, but I do feel that understanding the root causes and what is being done to fix that within the Ukrainian military is missing, because it feels sometimes that people hear that there is a manpower issue and they can assume that nothing is being done, and then Ukraine is just kind of railroading to a complete exhaustion and a complete extinction of their military, which is absolutely not the case. One thing is obviously the wounded and killed. That is existing, and that is definitely an attrition rate there. But I think the more prevalent problem of Ukrainian military is the desertion rate. If we take the official Ukrainian numbers, they're stating that they can mobilize 24,000 to 26,000 new troops every month. This has been challenged number that's been stating that this is a bit an overestimate on Ukrainian side, and it can be. Then we also have the attrition rate. Now, if we don't want to look too much in the attrition rate of Ukrainians, it is pretty low compared to Russians, but it is still relatively high if you take any other conflict in the world. So this is something we need to acknowledge. If we were to take the attrition rate of Russians, which is right now about 1,000 soldiers a day, then let's say we take the numbers that maybe not Russians are claiming, but maybe some of the, I don't want to say neutral, but like some of the third-party sources, they would say that roughly speaking, Ukrainians are being treated 3 times as much, three times as less as the Russians. So you can say there's about 300 soldiers a day that it's being wounded or killed in Ukrainian side. There is arguments from some of the Ukrainian channels that the ratio is a bit lower, but let's for now roll with this a bit higher number that is coming from more of a, again, very, very in quotation marks, neutral sources. And while there are certain deserted that later come back, because desertion doesn't necessarily mean that they completely escaped the Ukrainian military. Potentially, there was just a moron officer that just never gave an order to fall back, and yet the soldiers just fall back to some other safer positions, but it is still being recorded as desertion rate, because we are gauging the desertion rate from the Ukrainian armed forces based on the it's not criminal, but like administrative and criminal cases that are being submitted to the prosecutor's office. We know that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But in general, if we would want to kind of look at the big picture, the problem that Ukrainians are having is that when all of these things put together, the desertion rate and the attrition rate, then Ukraine just cannot grow their military. The number of their military is just sort of a constant, and we know that Russians have been increasing the number of their military. Now, their attrition rate is higher, but it is not high enough to prevent them from growing their military, because Russian society is just willing to sacrifice more. Their threshold for losses is higher, and I can talk in length about the issues of the Russian military, but in this video specifically, we are tackling the issues of Ukrainian military. And long story short, of the manpower problem that Ukrainian military is having is that their military manpower is lower than Russian, and it's somewhat constant. And this is where a lot of people get discouraged, because taking this at the face value, well, it is problematic. But I think this is where it's crucial to understand what is being done to tackle this issue and how it's being processed. The first issue with regards to desertions in Ukrainian military that was always underscored is the lack of training. A lot of people were claiming that they don't want to go to the military because they will be just thrown in to the front lines with little to no training. And this was true to an extent. People that got mobilized, specifically in territorial defense, that got a lot of drive from the beginning of the war, they were sent to the front lines. But there was a huge backlash in the Ukrainian society. So a lot of these people were actually, after that, pulled back to retrain. And there has been a grueling process of learning what does it take to be a trained soldier in Ukrainian military. Right now, Ukraine in this transitional state. There's many different training centers in Ukrainian military. And depending on which training center Ukrainian soldier, newly mobilized soldiers, is getting themselves into, they can get a training that is ranging from absolutely incredible and up to date to a training that is absolutely useless. And with regards to absolutely useless, I'm stating this, but I actually have a bit of a question mark whether that absolutely useless training is still persistent. Because the answers about the absolutely useless training that I've heard usually comes from people that were mobilized some 2 years ago. So they were in the training during the time when training was not as standardized. Right now, we've seen a lot of the good practices from the training come in from more experienced units, and general level of training has gone up. People are not just getting sent to the training centers to train based on the Russian military, not the Russian, but the Soviet military doctrines, or you can say Russian military doctrines of the Soviet Union. It's about the same, but that point is still is not standing anymore. The training centers have adapted their curriculum, and now when I'm asking some of the newer soldiers how are they being trained, in general, we can say that the new standards came in and training now is actually taking certain time. People are actually being given the time to train. And more importantly, they are being trained exactly the skills that they need to survive the modern warfare. So first mark that we put into the lack of morale or big desertion rate in Ukrainian military is that the training problem has been addressed by the Ukrainian system. Is it perfect? No, but it has been addressed and it is improving steadily. Then there is a problem of a poor morale that leads to a lot of desertions in the Ukrainian military, which is from morons, people at the wrong positions doing wrong things. The Soviet system that is very imperfect and motivates people to execute on action that supposedly leads to better results on paper, but in reality is just idiotic. For example, if positions have been retaken, then there's a prescription by the system to try to retake that position. Or the fact that there needs to be counterattacks constantly done to fight back the advancing enemy, and some other things. And then finally, the coordination of efforts between different units. Ukrainians have inherited after 2014 and built up a system that consists solely of brigades. And brigades were a useful unit to fight in that low effort, low pace war that was happening in Ukraine starting 2014 to 2022. However, now, as this is a bigger scale of war, Ukrainians needed some kind of a bigger, more coordinated units to fight the Russian tactic of advancing en masse, where coordination between units was the weakest spot of Ukrainian military, as Russians would usually find the weak spots specifically in the parts of the front line where it was, for example, one unit that is more experienced and the other unit that is less experienced. And because they have poor coordination, the Russians would find some kind of weak spot in between their area of responsibility and were able to penetrate the front line. It was still the case until recently. And this issue specifically is what you would hear if you would ask about issues in Ukrainian military to some of the Ukraine supporters, like pro-Ukrainian channels, the guys that really want to see Ukrainian army improve. And they would always underscore, they could phrase it as like there's a Soviet mentality, there is like a bad commanders and so on. And this is what it would lead to, the poor morale that would basically demotivate people participating in Ukrainian military, participating in some dumb decisions that would just lead to losses of your friends and colleagues, essentially leading you to this weird inevitable question is like, am I even going to survive, or I'm just going to be killed by some idiot that's going to follow idiotic orders, and then it's just going to be for no reason whatsoever. We've heard plenty of critique coming both from the Ukrainian supporters and the Ukrainian militaries themselves. And before people watching this video start losing consciousness because of the desperation hearing about this issue, it's important to underscore that this issue is well known and there has been steady efforts to improve the situation. You can argue that it has not been fast enough, and I understand the frustration, but it is crucial to understand that Ukrainian military is a big, complex system and mechanism where a lot of people don't really want to be in, which is filled with morons, as we discussed. And changing that kind of a big system where hundreds of thousands of people are in. Like if you worked in any kind of big company, you very clearly understand what I mean. The corporations, despite the fact that it's filled to the brim with people, with super knowledge, with people that really want to make sure that this corporation succeeds, very often the system itself is tailored or built in such a way that it just squeezes out any kind of efficiency or ability to change altogether. And when you put it like on a military, especially military that is in active combat, you get essentially an unmovable mountain of tasks and efforts that need to be achieved for any kind of meaningful change to take place. But that meaningful change has been taking place in the Ukrainian military. And most notable of all of this is the movement towards the core system. It has been announced about just over half a year ago that Ukraine will be moving from the brigade level command. They're going to be moving towards the core level command. So a core, in difference from what it was before, is beforehand there would be these temporary units that where commanders from different brigades would be stationed, and then they would try to kind of organize and cooperate these brigades on this local level, and they will try to then work together with these brigades and achieve some kind of success and ability to stop Russians. And this was working for a while. But as Russians increased their efforts, that started causing more and more issues, overlapping with the fact that a lot of the commandment of brigades, some of people would go to some other parts of the front line, and then they would pull parts of different brigades to different parts of front line, and you would end up in this absolutely messy, chaotic way of coordinating the defense efforts on the front lines. So now that I described you to this, the fact that Russia has barely achieved anything with Ukrainians, I don't want to say disorganized, because there is some kind of organization, but very poor organization. So even with that poor organization, Ukrainians were able to defend their territory pretty successfully. So what does the core system bring? Core system unifies Ukrainian different brigades into one specific core. And most importantly is that this core is not just like some new type of system that is being put on top of these brigades. No, it is some brigades that has shown great success in the way that they're organizing things, that they have some kind of internal culture that it was able to successfully spread to the people within, that they have some kind of a training procedures that were able to train effective soldiers, that they have set up a system for rotations, systems for supplies, systems for promotions, and other things, and other things, and other things. And that these brigades that showed themselves the best, it is around these brigades then other forces are being moved into, and the thought is that they're going to start taking in a lot of that culture and best practices that was worked through over these years of fighting. And the good news is we already have first results, and these results are fantastic. So not only people that went into training and people that work with these new type of core systems are stating that they're seeing results in their internal morale, in the way that people are coordinating now. Because remember, core is not some kind of a temporary coordination office. Core says, this is the forces that we're having, and it is our job to coordinate this common force. So they don't need to expect that there's going to be change of personnel in like the coming month or something, or different brigades will come to the units. They're able to coordinate and rotate through their own internal available forces. But more importantly, we actually have some data coming from the front line. There is already parts of the front line that are being taken over by the newly established corps. And remember, this is just corps in like infancy. We are still like, there's mountain of issues that a lot of people in these corps, they still need to work through their structure. But even in their infancy, we saw the tempo of Russian advancing at certain parts of the front line before these corps came in to take over, and then after these corps came to take over. And what we saw is 4 times increase in efficiency to defend against the Russian advances. Russian tempo of advancing have fallen in these areas where the Corps took over 4 times, and also losses of soldiers have been reported to be falling 2 times at least. So the corps, even in their infancy, are showing that there is better coordination, less losses on Ukrainian side, and more attrition and less efficiency on the Russian side. Fantastic results right out of the bat. For people that are worrying specifically, for example, about the Pokrovsk direction, this is like one of the most prevalent right now as I'm recording this, as we're speaking, there is a new corps coming in to Pokrovsk direction to take over and specifically tackle the issue of defending Pokrovsk. And we're going to follow up. If you want to have like something take away, like, well, we'll see if this works, what Georgie says or not, then you can look at what's happening right now in Pokrovsk. You can look at the tempo of Russian advancing before this moment and then after this moment and see if it's going to go down or not. It's a good, easy check. Another part of desertion is the way that people get mobilized into military. And this has been an actual problem because so far Zelensky's office has been running on the idea that a lot of, or at least the majority of people understand that they need to defend their country. But I feel that a lot of the Ukrainian society, I don't want to say they're burned through their motivation. Absolutely not true. If you ever are in Ukraine, actually, if you've seen the protests that just happened against the government taking these actions against the anti-corruption agencies, one thing that people misjudge is they're saying, oh, these people don't like what Zelensky is doing. That is not true. Just the biggest example for me, because I saw these protests, is that at these protests themselves, there were people that were standing with the signs and stating, yes, we must support the rule of law, democracy. Therefore, the best way to do so is to donate to the drones, to support our armed forces. No, there is still massive drive for Ukrainian society. But there's definitely more acknowledgement on the fact that it's like we cannot just fight on the will alone, that we need some other motivation. And obviously, Ukrainian military cannot fight the same way that Russians are fighting, because Russians are fighting by fear. If you follow this war at all, you know that in Russian military, the corporal punishment is very, very common. If you've seen people being dragged by their feet behind vehicles, if you've seen they're being put in the pits and essentially forced to fight to the death because they were abandoning their positions, Ukraine cannot do that. Ukraine is not this inhuman, barbaric state. But another thing that is happening in the Russian society, in Russian military, that is potentially replicable by the Ukrainians is monetary incentives. So far, Ukrainian military has been working, as I explained, on a lot of the goodwill. But I think finally the office of the president of Zelensky is acknowledging that that Ukrainian fighters needs additional motivation. And that motivation can only be fiscal. That is the only way that Ukrainians can go forward. And I believe truly that motivation of Ukrainian forces with additional funds is what's gonna reduce the desertion rate significantly. But I also think there is another very difficult discussion that Ukrainian government needs to have with society. What to do with deserters that don't come back. Now, I don't expect them to be forced in this penalty units that Russians are doing and sending them to storming positions. But I do feel some kind of a not really punishment, but at least value need to be instructed from these deserters. Like, because just putting them in jail is not beneficial for the Ukrainian war effort. I know that they broke the law, that they're criminals that should be put in prison. But I also feel that maybe putting them to like a sort of a semi-forced labor, they still can be paid for that labor, but at least make them dig trenches or work at the factories to produce equipment for the Ukrainian armed forces, like filling the shells or packing the boxes, like anything that can extract additional value without maybe going into some kind of absolutely brutal aspects of sending them to the front lines to storm the positions, what the Russians are doing. But I do feel that that discussion needs to happen in Ukrainian society, and it seems that it's slowly getting there just because of the fact that there is such a high rate of attrition, and there is already discussion within Ukrainian society that if we just do not change anything about this, then we're just gonna run out of people, and that's just gonna be unfair to all of the people that volunteer and sacrifice their lives for the sake of the state. And final part of morale is momentum, because as I explained before, the training has improved. The overall culture within the units is now also improving with the core system. The orders and everything is also improving with better coordination, again, in the same new core system, and it will be improving. But the final problem that is still persistent within the human psyche is momentum. The same momentum that you are having, seeing that Russians are kind of advancing and advancing and advancing, you're starting to build momentum towards perceiving things more negatively in general. It's a very common thing. The same is, for example, true for inflation. If you know that economists, when they're measuring inflation, one of the bigger things that they are putting into inflation estimates is expectations of the population, whether the society is going to expect that the inflation will be higher. So if there is a persistent narrative and idea that there is going to be a lot of issues within the Ukrainian military, that Russians are going to continue advancing, it builds up this momentum of thought that Ukrainian military is going to continuously do worse. And the same goes for the people inside of trenches. So working against that momentum, putting a lot of effort in messaging around the Ukrainian military is crucial for Ukraine to go forward. The next issue in Ukrainian military that has been tackled a lot is defenses. For a very long time, Ukrainian soldiers have been writing in Telegram channels, talking between themselves. They have been stating that defenses are inadequate, that amount of work that goes into their defense fortification and the type of work that is being done is inadequate. The issue was both systematic, because a lot of the defenses have been built so far by the civil authorities in different parts of the front line, and they would hire some civil workers to dig out trenches in the middle of nowhere, and they would dig out trenches based on some kind of setup that was actual maybe for the Second World War, but is not actual to the current situation. And more importantly, they would dig out different trenches individually or within like a specified project, but not as part of the whole infrastructure. This attitude has been changing significantly. Firstly, there is now incorporation of a new types of defenses that are needed on the front line because the war has changed. We have moved away from the Russian massive attacks on the columns of armored vehicles to now Russians trying to storm in small groups by using motorcycles, by having a lot of these aviation bombs being a threat. So concealment of movement in between positions become a lot more prevalent. So having just an open trench where people are moving, where the drones can see you, where we can just detect where exactly your positions are, is now pretty much a death sentence, whereas having like underground systems, having these small concealed bunkers can potentially be more beneficial altogether. And we see Ukrainians incorporating not only those best practices on how to create these defensive structures, but also they are building these big projects. The so-called new Donbas line that is being built in Ukraine is massive in its scale, but also it incorporates all of these ideas in the wide front. So there is normal, massive defense lines that are being built to be responsible. Again, as you can see, Ukraine is just consolidating that knowledge to scale things up, because compared to 2014 and even the start of 2022, we now have just a bigger operation scale. It's not anymore like a small units fighting some small disorganized units. It's the Russian military that organized itself into the bigger units. And yes, they're using the small unit tactic, but they use it as like a bigger front, and bigger coordination and more aligned defenses are needed to stop this kind of offense. So again, great job for Ukrainians that they fixed that issue. And now even the biggest critiques of Ukrainian command are stating that yes, the fortifications now are becoming actually good. And finally, the equipment. It is an issue and it will be an issue. It is very hard to gauge where exactly we're standing on equipment overall. But there is a thought, an idea in a lot of the people's minds that Ukraine just needs like certain equipment and then it's going to win. That is not the case. What Ukraine needs is bigger scale of stuff. Ukraine, the same thing that they needed from the get-go, from the start of this war, they just needed more stuff. It is unfortunately better to have a lot of okay equipment than just very few of very good equipment. And we in the Western world, we were mostly focusing on having that the latter than the former. We have some equipment that is very, very good, but the amount of it is not as much. And this is where the good news come in with the Danish model and the investments by the Europeans to support Ukrainian production. We see massive increase in Ukrainian output. I am in person talk with a lot of people that are stating that Europeans have really stepped up in this first half a year. And we saw these also in obvious numbers, as now it's being reported that the European countries were able to substitute the help that basically Donald Trump stopped sending to Ukraine, that European states were able to substitute the monetary amount that was dedicated also from the United States in the previous terms. The difference being that a lot of those investments are coming into Ukrainian production. And Ukrainians are specifically targeting that aspect of good and mass scaled. And this is going to be a real game changer in maybe 6 to 7 to 8 months for a lot of Ukrainian forces on the ground. Equipment will always be a shortage because equipment is always needed. But Ukrainians are stepping up, Europeans are stepping up, and in general, we've seen that, for example, artillery shell-wise, Europeans are covering a lot of what Ukraine needs, and Ukrainians are also covering themselves what they need. And we see that even Trump is more changing to being this Trump that wants to have some kind of negotiations with Putin, to maybe becoming a lot more transactional in nature, something that I was hoping and expecting Trump will be when he got elected. But this is a whole another talk. In general, what we need to understand is the investment in Ukrainian armed forces is happening. The new equipment is coming in. The mass of equipment is slowly but surely increasing. And hopefully we see, as Ukrainians are conducting attrition on the Russian forces, Russians are getting amounts of equipment they're having a little bit pushed down. There's obvious challenges such as Russian Shahed drones. There's challenges with the Russian drones on fiber optics. That is all true, and that is still going to be an issue on the front line, but Ukrainians are trying to find their answers to these issues. To sum up, big picture, this video was not meant to discourage anyone. Quite the contrary. I just wanted to highlight the actual challenges, the problems, systematic, massive, really tough problems that Ukrainians are trying to tackle. But I also wanted to highlight that despite the critique that a lot of Zelensky's office is getting, that a lot of shit that Syrskyi and the Ukrainian army command is getting, that things are trying to be moved towards the right direction, to make Ukrainian military be more bearable in this awful war that Ukraine never asked for. There is not a country in the world that wants more peace than Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Yet Russia is the one that is forcing this war on Ukraine. And they're really trying. They're really trying to do the best they can. You can argue if they're succeeding or not, but the movements are there. So important thing for us all to take away from this is that issues are there. They are being acknowledged. They're being discussed in Ukrainian society and even here on this channel. We must not overlook the issues, but they should not be the things that are saying things like, okay, we must just lay down and die, I guess. No. The work must be done. The work must be done by the Ukrainian armed forces. And more importantly, the work must be done by the people that support the Ukrainian armed forces. And this is exactly what we're doing on this channel. We're having frank and honest discussions about the issues, and we are looking to what we can do to help Ukraine and Ukrainian soldiers that are sacrificing their lives on the front lines to make it just a little bit more bearable. Either it's by supplying them with trucks, with weapons, or whatever else we can. Guys, support the Ukrainian armed forces and trust the Ukrainian armed forces. There's massive amounts of people that are overcoming these challenges every day, waking up in cold trenches, but still doing their jobs. And those people are amazing. And you are amazing for making it this far in this video. I love you. Slava Ukraini, trust in Ukrainian armed forces, and I will see you next time.